Let's see, microphone. Select as microphone, same in the system. Okay, so this is a video here where we are going to be discussing frameworks for thinking. I'm with two guests who I'll let them introduce themselves shortly, but I just want to say that before starting that the point of this video is to, in some sense, let you all know about a new project I'm involved in titled the School for Thinking. The School for Thinking is a year-long program and initiative which is being tested out at the Free University of Brussels in Brussels. And the point of the program is to cultivate thinking. There are, of course, many programs and many courses where you can study a particular framework or study a particular subject, but there are, at least the ethos of the program and the claim of the program is that there are few opportunities to study thought itself. And with that aim of studying thought in itself, we are hoping to build a culture and an environment of cultivating intelligence, of exploring different toolkits and methods for thought, of exploring different frameworks, alternative frameworks, and how they operate, and also trying to integrate self-discipline and open-endedness in our thinking. So with that introduction, and just a quick reminder that you can find links in the description to any further information about the program if you want to enroll, if you want to join the School of Thinking. But today we're just going to be exploring the idea of different frameworks of thinking to give you a sense of the type of problems and the types of reflections we would like to approach in this course. So with that in mind, I will let my two collaborators in this conversation introduce themselves. So Maciej, if you want to be the first to introduce yourself.
Sure. Just a quick sound test. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, it's coming through great.
Cool. So my name is Maciej. I'm a consultant and facilitator. I live and work in Poland at a university spin-off, called the Jagiellonian University Extension. I'm a psychologist by education, and my first more academic interest was metacognitive aspects of learning. So I was asking, how do we know what we know, or how do we know our skill level, and so on. But then I moved on to working with people in organizations, usually in management positions. And then, as I said, you can call it consulting or facilitation or coaching from time to time. But the main common denominator of those things are, helping people to have the kind of conversations they should be having with each other, right? Also helping people to think together about what they should think about. And that means cognitively facing the complexity of the environment they're working in, but also emotionally, bearing the burden of that conversation as well, right? So that's maybe the best succinct description of what I do.
Okay, great. What about you, Seyfan? Do you want to introduce yourself and a little bit about what your interests are? Seyfan, are you with us?
Seems like she's here, but not connected with her audio.
Okay, well, while we're waiting for Seyfan, I'll just quickly maybe throw out and try to frame this discussion on frameworks for thinking. in your opinion, Magic, what are frameworks for thinking, and how do you see how do you understand the concept of framework? Maybe that's the best place to start.
Okay, so that's a really broad question, and I have even a broader answer if you're okay with that. So one thing we have to consider as we are starting to think about thinking is that we are using brains to do that originally evolved to, tell the other apes where the right fruit is, right? Or, originally evolved to calculate the trajectory of projectiles as you throw them. In other words, we are using tools that were not designed to, or did not evolve to consider things like the Higgs boson or the nature of reality or the refraction of light as it passes through a prism or whatever else. So we are kind of using leftover building blocks that are there for a reason, and that's not the reason we are using them for, right? Which means they are not always the best tools or the best ways to tackle the complex problems we want to think about and talk about. And we have to find workarounds, right? We have to find ways of making it possible for us to talk about stuff like Higgs bosons and about cultural relativism and whatever else you might fancy to be willing to discuss, right? And so one way of understanding framework works, or understanding the concept of their usefulness, is to think, okay, these are the apps, if you use a cell phone metaphor, or these are the software we are trying to install in our brains to be able to tackle the problems we are not really, good at, and with our bare brains, right? So that would be one way of thinking about that. So creating a common tool to address complexity or to address something that is not really easy to tackle with the bare, unprepared mind. How's that for an answer?
Okay, so I get the impression there that that you're seeing frameworks as kind of like sort of like simplified programs that we develop in order to share dialogue about reality and to approach the complexity of reality in a meaningful way.
Yeah, that'll be a good summary of what I said.
Okay, so how do you imagine kind of the thinking school as a place to play around with these software programs? Like, what would be like when I think about, for example, starting as an undergrad, and I had a chance basically, if I'm going to go off this metaphor of the software program, to pick between different programs that are already established. So I could take anthropology, I could take history, I could take biology, and I'm going to be learning a certain ontology, or I'm going to be learning a certain set of rules for approaching reality. But here with the thinking school, we are in some sense approaching that process as such. Have you ever had an experience before in your work where this type of skill could be cultivated, or this type of approach could be explored in itself? What do you see as the benefits of this?
Yeah, I think it's the main point in a way of what we do when we are working with people, right? Because if you use the metaphor of an app, of a software tool, whatever, something you use to interpret reality and make it possible for you to even address some of the issues that are there. One think that is a common pitfall is that you start to confuse that tool or that way of defining things with reality itself, right? So it's not a theoretical abstract problem. It's a very practical problem, that makes people quite inefficient and stuck at some points, right? So just to give a quick example, in marketing, it's really useful to think, because of our, evolutionary background, I guess, it's really useful to think about brands as if they were people from time to time, and you can ask questions like, okay, so if your company were a person, what kind of person would that be? What's the what are the personality traits of that person? What does the person like? Whatever. It's a useful way of thinking, right? But it's the important part is that brands are not people, right? So it can be a useful way of talking about some concepts, but it's not the only way. It's certainly not useful for context, right? So and more, to the point of your question, you ask, are there any practical benefits of shifting the thinking, or are there any practical consequences of using a different approach, a different filter to address reality? Certainly, and the most recent example is with strategic planning, with trying to get a group of top managers to consider the complexity of the environment they are working in. So the most standard way, the more popular way of doing that, is just helping people to, let's say, do a SWOT analysis, do an analysis of the context, and then set a mission, vision, whatever strategy, set goals. And there's this assumption behind that there's this future that is coming up, and you are heading toward it to seize the ripe fruit of opportunity, or whatever the latest lingo is about that. Now, consider switching this type of conversation to a similar but slightly different one. If you invite people to define some potential scenarios in which the reality, the environment they're functioning in might be evolving, or or be revolutionized from this point on. Just switch the type of question you're asking, but suddenly you're functioning in reality where there's a couple of uncertain possibilities that can unravel, and they can change the way your company, your organization, your community is functioning very dramatically, right? So, on a very simple level, just moving from one scenario to, 5 potential scenarios, it's not challenging many assumptions that people have. It's just switching one of them. Suddenly we are living in a reality that is much more flexible, much more complex, much more uncertain, but we are able to address more issues or different issues that way, right? And that is not even challenging the more deep assumptions that people have there, right? So that you actually can and should predict the future, that this should be done top down from the head of the company, moving down in a cascade toward the line employees, and it's not even moving it a lot, and you get a very different set of results.
Okay, so what I'm getting from that is, like, when you're open, I think first, like, the crucial thing is, in order to play with frames of thinking, you have to be dealing with people, or you have to be dealing with subjects who are first open to such an activity in itself, right? Like, if you have people, or if you have subjects who are so connected to their frame of reference, if they're so connected to their way of thinking, or their mode of thinking, or their software program of thinking, then it might be very difficult to engage with this type of activity, or this type of program, or this type of the activity that we're trying here with the School of Thinking. But one of the things that stuck out to me when you were describing the benefits of playing with frames of reference is this oftentimes this this problem of confusing the tool or the software program with reality itself. And that this can create a lot of social friction. It can create a lot of inefficiency. It can create a lot of stubbornness. And what the question I would ask is, in regards to this confusing the framework with reality, is where do you think this cognitive predisposition comes from? You know, like if you have, for example, a sort of scientific frame of reference or a physics paradigm, for example, and you might think that the Newtonian model of the universe is the universe itself, or something like this. Where do you think this cognitive predisposition comes from? And what do you think are the benefits of getting some distance between you could say, the epistemology from the thing in itself, if that makes sense? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does make sense. I think, there's two ways of answering the question, the philosophical one and the psychological one, right? So you're the philosopher here. So I won't waste plenty of your time, by just saying, okay, there's this kind of enshrinement of rational thought, of a certain way of understanding physics, Newtonian way, a certain set of cultural structures that support the hierarchical top-down model of what it is to be rational and what it is to be intelligent, and what is the defining feature of a human being, namely the ability to use reason, and so on and so forth. So there's this whole discussion that is happening, I'm not sure, for the past 50 years, I guess, challenging this clean, black and white, rational discourse. And I will not add much to it. But I think there's this psychological part to it that is more relevant to my perspective. And it's simply that complexity and uncertainty are two very difficult things to bear emotionally. The ability to function in an environment that is not defined, that is uncertain, is simply taking a lot of mental effort, right, and emotional effort, because you're constantly on watch, you're constantly questioning your choices, you're constantly alert to what is and what is not right, and that's really tiring. Right? As opposed to having a model of the world that is maybe imperfect, maybe it's too schematic for some applications, but it gives you the comfort and safety of knowing that things are in order, that you're headed for the bright future, that you're doing the right thing, and so on and so forth. Right? So there's all sorts of mental shortcuts that we need to use just to get around the overwhelming amount of complexity we have to deal with, especially these days. But it's not impossible for us to address those problems. The problem is that you have to put in effort to do that, right? And emotional effort at that.
Right. So it's actually like, I think it's, I really resonate with your answer. And like the thing that jumps out to me here is, like, when we think about, again, just using scientific materialism as an example in regards to, like, sort of, default ontologies and our presuppositions of what the world is. Oftentimes we don't include some of the things that you're bringing up here. So, like, for example, when we think about it from the perspective of psychology or cognition, about having a frame of reference of what the world is in itself, and we're investigating, say, the orbits of the planets or certain forces at work in nature. We often don't take into consideration that the cognitive agent or the embodied being, which is framing this reality, has certain emotional needs, has certain psychical temperaments. For example, like you brought up, the need for comfort and safety and sort of a moral compass, and that it takes a lot of mental and emotional effort, a lot of mental and emotional work, to have the sort of distance between the software program you're using and reality in itself. So like if you're going to make this jump between tool and reality, and you're constantly sort of using your frames of reference as more of a sort of heuristic for what might be true in certain contexts, and also open to what you think as an absolute truth to be actually false. It takes you have to include your own individual emotional maturation as a person. So, for example, when we're thinking about this school of thinking, and we're thinking about this program, for example, sort of like a year-long program of exploring different frameworks of thinking, how do you think people in the program, or even instructors in the program, might deal with these more emotional, these more these more personal dimensions of our relationship to the way we currently think?
Okay, so I'd like to refer to the first part of what you said, and then to answer the question, if possible. So you said it is an example of this framework that gives people comfort is the materialistic, scientific, certain understanding of a scientific worldview, right? I think it's not, right? So, if you really, take this materialistic, scientific perspective, well, there's a couple of things you need to consider, like, there is not God, no God, there's no afterlife, you're going to be gone very soon, life has no inherent meaning, only the one that you make, and so on and so forth, right? So I think the go-to model for people, to refer to is not the scientific, rational physicalism, if you call it that, right? Because it does not satisfy some of those important emotional needs that we've been talking about. But that's just a side note. And a real question that you asked was, okay, how can we help people deal with that, or how can we help people think better if it's difficult? And I guess it's impossible to just perceive reality as it is, or just throw away all of your assumptions and maps and all of your models and just face the Ding an sich, and just take it in. But what you can do is you can play. You can switch between models. You can test things out in a sort of a laboratory space where it's safer. You don't need to really take on the assumptions and believe them, and you don't have to convert to one way of thinking. You don't have to commit to any model that you're currently entertaining, because it's an experimental space. It's a laboratory space, right? It's a playful exploration. And play, I think it's a very serious thing here, right? You can experiment with ways of looking at the world, and all of them will be biased, and all of them will be somehow just a glimpse of whatever it is that you want to explore. But if you have 3 ways instead of just one, you get the gist of, there might be a 4th one, right? There might be a 5th one. There might be some other approaches that you're not considering yet. And I think it does make you, for lack of a less, solemn word, does make you a better human being, more mature human being. It also makes you more effective, right? And in some areas, at least, when it's important to be able to deal with complex things.
So I'm getting here that, like, the first thought that comes into my mind is that, oh, well, one, of course, I agree that the default worldview or frame or approach to reality is not necessarily the materialistic scientific frame in some simplistic sense, just simply because it doesn't satisfy these emotional needs that most humans have, and so forth. But the other sense I got from your response was that in the common scientific worldview, it has built into it this idea of experimenting with reality out there, and that if reality out there does not conform to our model, then we'll discard with the model and develop a new model that would better conform to the reality we're testing out there. But I think that the picture I'm getting here from what you were saying about the thinking school is that it's kind of the opposite point of view, where we're willing to experiment with the models themselves. So like, we don't need to commit to one model, but we're rather building a laboratory space to play with models. You know, about, you know, and we could say simultaneously hold, say, you know, maybe, I don't know if you would agree, but maybe you would say like an emotionally or a developmentally mature human would be able to hold multiple different models and sort of see their use value depending on context or depending on situation. But now the question comes to my mind, is there a meta way to, say, for example, measure a utility of a frame, or like why we would pick one frame over another? Are we going for a type of, you know, coherence of the frame, consistency of the frame? Are we measuring the frame based on sort of the emotional development one could cultivate with a certain frame of reference? You know, these types of questions are coming to my mind because the framework is the image I'm getting here is that the framework is not so much about whether it's reflecting some external reality so much as it is integrating or helping a person develop their cognitive capacities to affect a certain change or to achieve a certain task. You know, it's I guess in a cognitive frame of reference, it would be, you know, we're thinking about either the goals or the dreams or the desires or the relationships that one would like to cultivate. Does that resonate with you in terms of?
Yeah, I think you're saying very eloquently, you know, what I basically agree with, right? So the question is, you know, if we set aside the question of what is the one and only truth. I mean, there might be some one and only truth, but it's quite hard to get, and especially, you know, thinking that you have one is not conducive to your finding it, right? And if we, you know, set that criteria, like, you know, the truth is, you know, the relationship between you, what you have in your mind, and reality, you know, however you might be willing to define it and touch it. Then the other criteria that pops up is, okay, does it help you get something useful? Does it help you notice some new options you haven't been noticing before, right? Because we don't need to just focus on questions like what is the nature of reality or what is the meaning of the human life. You can also ask you know, some more practical and simpler questions that are still quite mind-boggling when it comes down to it, right? How do we create a space in our societies for people to explore their freedom and diversity without actually, you know, hurting other people, right? Quite practical question. And, you know, as you start thinking about that, the assumptions you're making, the tools you're using, you know, are going to be different depending on the model that you refer to, right? You're going to, just to give you a very simple example, you're going to have very different ideas if you have the assumption that society is some sort of a machine, right? Or some sort of organism, or some sort of a collective, you know, meeting of individuals as opposed to a set of groups, right? So those models resonate throughout the history of sociology and politics and so on and so forth, and they have very practical consequences. You are going to do different things with people or to people based on what thinking tool you're using.
Right. And so like, I mean, the you know, the direction here that you're pointing to me is, you know, it's very, appealing to many people, not just scientists, but also I think also people in a religious frame of reference or even a philosophical frame of reference, to want to get at some sort of one truth, to get at some unified absolute truth of what reality is, but that when you go to the frame of reference in itself, you start thinking more pragmatically about maybe expanding degrees of freedom or diversity of thought or diversity of opinion. And this becomes a different telos or a different aim or a different goal for the formation of conceptual models. One of the interesting things that also popped up is that this identification that many of our frameworks are actually based on metaphors, for example, of the universe as a machine, or the universe as an organism, or the universe as a computer, say, is a very common metaphor that's deployed in contemporary thinking. I would just ask, how do you understand how metaphors structure a certain framework, oftentimes unconsciously or oftentimes without actually reflecting on the fact that there is a metaphor, for example, grounding a certain framework of like the universe as a clockwork or the universe as a computer. And how would you understand that? Like, for example, I would just ask, that as a secondary question, if we're thinking about frameworks as building, for example, spaces of new forms of freedom, what metaphor would be implied in such an aim or goal? But I guess my first question would be, what do you think is this relationship between frameworks and metaphor? Because I really think it's an interesting cognitive question.
Okay. Well, first year psychology, cognitive psychology course answer would be, we have to have metaphors. We have to have models because they help us simplify the unfathomable complexity of what we are dealing with, right? So, just to put that in context, cognitive psychologists are talking about working memory, this imaginary space, again, based on, computer metaphor that you're using to conduct the, everyday operations in your mind, not the long-term storage, but the workbench you're using to play with symbols, right? And, different approximations say that the size of this workbench is either 7 plus minus 2 chunks or 4 plus minus 1 chunk. So in a way, it's less than 10, right? So you can have very intelligent, smart people with big brains and so on, so can handle like 9 chunks of information at once and process them, or you can have the less gifted, with 5 of them. Either way, it's not 39. Right, so we are all in a way limited by the amount of information we can actually process, make sense of at any given time. Which is, I wanted to comment on what you said before, like, it's about the hope of holding few frames of reference at once in mind. It's impossible, right, to hold more than one frame of reference at once, right? We can switch between them. So again, right? So it's a pure information processing limitation that we have. It's like a hard limit in one perspective. We can only consider so much at a time, and we are great at actually dealing with that, right? Considering that we actually can talk about Higgs bosons, and we can come up with ways of splitting the atom, whatever, send a man to the moon and so on. But it's possible with the use of thinking tools, right? With the use of metaphors as thinking tools, right? Because that gives you some frame of reference that kind of simplifies and takes away the complexity of most of the issue you're working with, and it allows you to deal with the limited but essential qualities that you have to work out. And just to supplement that with an example, because I'm really always really concerned with the fact that most people around us are not asking themselves the questions about the nature of reality. They are asking themselves question, okay, how do I sell more toothpaste, right? Or how do I get to work more efficiently today? So it's like, the question is, is this discussion we are having now relevant to those sort of problems, right? And I think, yes, it is. And just to give you a quick example, we've been discussing a strategy with a group of one mining industry company, and the mind-boggling complexity of 10 different sites in different countries with different legal systems, with different technological solutions, with different people expectations, and so on and so forth. And there's like 10 people with so many things to share about the details of what they are just now dealing with, right? And we are exploring 4 possible scenarios of how this could unfold in the future. And it's really working at the top capacity of our brains. I'm kind of understanding half of what they are saying, half of the language they are using in the moment. And one question that pops up into my mind is, okay, in this situation, if your company was an animal, what kind of animal would survive best in this condition, right? And this guy says, okay, so we need to be an octopus. And some other guys say, oh, no, we need a hawk, right? And suddenly, the conversation is much more focused and much more useful, because there's so many added meaning that they can express with the animal that they refer to. So much added meaning, right? So, really down to earth, pragmatic reasons for that. And it's interesting how this can take over our thinking, though, right? So the cost of it is that you get the whole package, and including the assumptions that you were not thinking of, or maybe they are limiting you. So that was just the answer to the first question, and it was long enough for me to forget the second one.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's a train of thought here that opens up in my mind from this answer anyway, because, the thing that comes into my head is that I've spent the last, say, few years thinking about, or thinking from the perspective of, complexity science, and that complexity science tries to think about how can we develop models to understand the complexity of the world. But I like this idea here that when you think from the perspective of the metaphor, and you think from the perspective of our cognition, that actually what models are trying to do is actually simplify our reality so that it makes it possibly navigable in a desirable way. And it makes me think about what do you think is this relationship between the complexity of the thing in itself, you might say, which is beyond our comprehension, that our limited cognitive capacities, prevent us from understanding, reality as as it is in itself, and as complex as it possibly is, that we just can't understand it because of certain cognitive limitations. But that what our models are ways that consciousness can simplify reality so that it is something that we can thrive in, and use to our best advantage, which actually makes me think about the relationship between cognitive science and a type of Darwinian maximization of fitness, or maximization of long-term survival, long-term viability. So my main question would be, how do you understand here this attempt in the sciences to reconcile with complexity, as our civilization becomes more complex, as our as we become more complex as agents, and then this desire of the model, of the metaphor, and maybe the necessity to simplify, to let's just get at the essence here of what we're trying to do in our local context, and in relationship to our local fitness, say.
Okay, so two thoughts here. One is more of a side thought, which is when you mentioned Darwinian thinking, I think it's we're really doing a perverse thing to our biology, because we're hijacking it, right? So maybe we evolved as vehicles for genes, and with some impulses or parts of our psyche that are designed by the natural selection to maximize the number of grandchildren we're going to have, right? But we are quite good at saying screw you to that tendency, and we have people living in celibate. We have people who are studying philosophy and doing a PhD in psychology, both of which are kind of should be eliminated by natural selection if it takes long enough, if this institution of taking a university degree is going to last long enough for natural selection to take place. It should be eliminated, right? Because it certainly decreases the number of grandchildren you're going to have. So we are doing something quite blunt against the Darwinian mechanisms that we often refer to, and yet we have to think about the same fitness in the cultural environment we are creating. Right, so I'm not sure if what I'm saying is not just a very elaborate way of saying something simple, but yes, we need to use our thinking and the metaphors or the ways of framing our thinking, not just the content but the structure of it, to help us deal with whatever issues we have right now, or will go extinct. Right, so there's like just to refer to the most obvious, application of that line of thought, it's like either we find a way of tackling the climate change challenges, either we find a way of helping people understand what's going on around them and face it, or we might face some serious problems as a species. Right, so it's like again, very pragmatic aspect of what we are trying to do here.
Okay, well, like I think that you're bringing up one of it's maybe a quite niche interest of mine to try to understand this relationship between a standard biological Darwinian understanding of fitness maximization and the way in which our frameworks of thinking or our cultural abilities problematize this relationship. Because as you're saying, about you have people who are, for example, choosing to live a celibate existence. There are monks and nuns who will actively choose not to reproduce, for example, or there's that philosophy student who is just, instead of dedicating the prime reproductive years of his life to building a family, is instead hiding away in some ivory tower reading Aristotle and Plato, or something like this. And it makes me think about this idea that our cultures and our modes of thinking are themselves sort of elements of reproduction, or themselves undergoing a types of fitness maximization potentially. What do you think about that as an analogy? It may not be a perfect analogy. Of course, it's deployed in memetics, for example, that you make this analogy of genes and memes, or you can make this analogy between biological forms and cultural forms as somehow trying to maximize their reproductive viability. You might say that the philosopher, for example, is trying to make sure that his paradigm of thinking will continue on through the ages. And for example, that Plato as a body of culture has successfully reproduced itself, or for example, the monk or the nun are developing certain spiritual technologies which will reproduce themselves as viable spiritual technologies deep into the future, for helping humans deal with their own emotional twists and turns of being finite mortal beings or something like this. Do you think that is an interesting frame to consider, or do you think that it has its own limitations and pitfalls and of course
it's certainly fun to consider, because if you're using that line of thinking, then you're being like some people say, oh, finally we can detach from evolution and biology, and finally there's something else going on that is more human, more cultural, right? But if you take that perspective, it's really just switching the virus that hijacks your brain, so instead of the genes using us as vehicles to reproduce themselves, now we have the idea of celibacy using the nuns and monks to reproduce itself, right? Which is a fun line of thinking to consider, and it's I'm not sure if it doesn't have its own problem. It certainly has them, but if you want to make this understanding more subtle and useful and less just a fun idea to entertain at the pub, then I think it's interesting. It's not my fault. It's one put forth by Daniel Dennett, that there's a part of the human culture that is still a culture, but it's spread without reflection. It just like a catchy melody that that you hear somewhere and you find yourself whistling. It's more like a virus invading your brain, and it's using you to reproduce itself. But we are also known to raise or create or design means to that we find valuable and useful to deliberately infest our brains with. Right, so there's this distinction between non-reflective transmission of cultural content. Let's call that, right. So some words just spread, some ideas just spread by themselves, by virtue of whether they cater to our important needs, whether they are memorable enough, whether they are giving you some benefit, and they just they are not designed, they are just appearing, right? But then we become reflective of this happening, and we design things like schools in which we want to infect young people with certain set of structures that we find useful. And another useful analogy, another useful observation that makes in that respect is that chickens that are bred in captivity have smaller brains, right? They are less fit, they are less able to survive on their own compared to wild birds, right? And similarly, he says that once something is taught at school, it can stop being interesting. Right, because we are, making sure that it's transmitted, and it does not get transmitted by virtue of its own qualities alone. Right, so it doesn't have to be so attractive. It doesn't have to be so sticky in a way.
Right. I think I was gonna bring up that paradox in some sense, because I think it's kind of like this paradoxical reversal where, yes, ideas and paradigms and worldviews can, or or just catchy songs, right, can be spread without reflection. But then we become aware of this process, and then we become more reflective about it, and we try, like you said, build schools to share, for example, the most reflective information, supposedly. But then even that can become unreflective, right? So
Okay, yes.
for example, if you think about some of the greatest paradigms that have ever been developed in human history, oftentimes the people who developed them were not themselves inside the university. They were outside the university, and then the universities sucked them up. So, for example, when I think about Charles Darwin, he was on his boat in the middle of nowhere. Or if you think about Albert Einstein, he was in the patent clerk office. Or if you think about, for example, even someone like Karl Marx or Friedrich Nietzsche, these people weren't inside the university working as professors. They were outside the university, and then their ideas became sort of caught up inside the university. So it's there's this paradoxical reversal, but the which is interesting in itself to think, right? But like in some sense, what we're trying to do here with the thinking school is only necessary because, you could imagine we're presupposing that the university itself doesn't care about thinking, that they're interested in thinking about some pre-established form of knowledge, whereas we're interested in this very mechanism of thought generation itself. So in regards the idea that came up to me here is in regards this differentiation between, a thought which is non-reflectively transmitting information versus thought which is, self-reflectively transmitting information. Do you think that this has some way of relating to notions that you brought up before about freedom, developing spaces of freedom where thought can explore? Like, would you define freedom in these terms of this level of reflectivity, that the more reflective, that the more reflective we are about the words we're saying, the more reflective we are about the paradigms we're operating in, the more free we are? Is that too much of a simplification?
I think it's a good summary. I mean, yes, I would agree that the greater ability to distance yourself from the assumption you're currently working, or the model you're using, or the metaphor you're seeing the word through, gives you, I think, at least it's the highest level of freedom attainable, right? So you can be able to change the way you're thinking through the change of the assumptions you're making, or the things you're using. But I think it's maybe I'm less ambitious than that, or maybe I have a different background. But because for me, the biggest value of or how we are positioned in relationship to the rest of the society, it's not because universities are not teaching or not focusing on thinking enough, we have to do this job, right? It's more, just to simplify, it's more like because people out there in the world, having university education or not, when they are struggling with things, they are usually struggling with the content of things. Right. So when you're thinking about, okay, how do I structure my organization, or how do I live a happy life, or how do I help people get healthy, or whatever else, you're very embedded in the content, in the knowledge that you have acquired at the university or otherwise, but you're struggling with the whatever you're seeing, right? And what we are trying to offer to people is, okay, so you're seeing with a certain set of lens, you're using a telescope, you're using a microscope here. Here are the other tools or other ways of looking, right? So how about we stop for a while and just focus, on your way of looking, your way of defining things, and maybe that will help you move forward in whatever it is you're struggling with. Right? So it's, in other words, I'm not seeing this like an anti-establishment activity or anti-rigid structure versus this rock program that we're trying to create. It's more like, again, it's not obvious that thinking about thinking should be a thing, right? It's not obvious when you're trying to tackle, 90% of the things you're tackling every day. It is useful, but it's something that requires inspiration and practice.
Right. Well, I think that differentiation between frame and content, or that differentiation between lens and content, it's not what you're looking at, but we're focusing on the lens or the frame through which we analyze content. And sort of as you were saying, that the way you're looking at the content can sometimes be the difference between helping you move forward with a certain struggle, a certain existential issue that you are battling or combating, and maybe becoming stuck or deeply frustrated or perhaps emotionally distraught about a certain situation that you are struggling with. So, I mean, I think that's a good summary, perhaps, of this talk and thinking about frameworks for thinking in itself. So, I just want to before sort of letting you here have the final word, remind people that yet again, there's links in the description if you're interested in learning more about the Thinking School, interested in learning about what this program is about. Again, I would like just reiterate that one of our main goals for the Thinking School is to build a space where we can cultivate intelligence, understanding what intelligence is, how we think, and how thinking about the way we think can perhaps help us, again, with these existential problems of dealing with a complex reality. We want the program to be about offering people who join a way to think about toolkits, a way to think about methods, a way to think about frames of reference, and again, to balance this difference between self-disciplined thinking and open-ended thinking, and really pushing our own limitations and really challenging ourselves cognitively as people, as human beings who are not just interested in, as Maciej said throughout this talk, not just interested about getting to some one objective truth, but about sort of trying to understand the way in which we are embedded in this very process of whether it's searching for truth or searching for freedom or searching for just a better life. So Maciej, if you have any final words here,
not great at final words.
Okay, let's leave it open.
I do think there's like a need for that type of work around us. We can see it when you switch on the news and when we go to work, right? So in a way, we are prepared to do our jobs. Right, so you do a job of an HR business partner, you do a job of a university teacher, you do a job of a sales clerk, and so on. And you can go on doing that job, right? It's one way of handling whatever it is that life puts in front of you. But more and more we are facing problems that are kind of one level higher than this specific job description or this specific position you were put in, right? There's some need to have a more collective dialogue about things that are really important for us in terms of the well-being and survival of our societies, right? And this is really hard because our job descriptions do not include that type of challenges, right? So there's plenty of people around the world asking themselves, okay, so how could I even address that, right? How could I even, start a conversation about that? And maybe sometimes those conversations don't get started because we don't find the right context, the right platform, the right group of people to have those conversations with. right? So yeah, if I ever were to summarize this, it's, you know, what I hope this will be, this school will be creating is a platform for that type of one step higher conversations that are still very relevant to what people are struggling with on a daily basis, and then maybe help them to bring those type of conversations back. All right, so that's my hope for the program.
Right. Well, I think that's well said, and maybe we can leave the conversation there and just sort of welcome anyone who's interested in these topics to get in touch with us directly if they're interested to learn more. So I'll leave Magic's information in the description as well, and as you know, my information is always in the description. So thank you so much for holding this space with me for an hour, Magic. I thought it was a really interesting discussion, and
it was my pleasure to be here, wherever here is.
Okay. All right. See you later.
Thank you.